Welcome to the Venusian Womb Codes, Volume 1. These teachings are offered as living threads to support your embodiment, intuition, and integration. Settle your body, soften your breath, and receive what is ready to meet you today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Venusian Womb Codes Volume 1. This is transmission 4 out of 6, and today we are going to be talking about the Code of Distortion. So these distortions are products of the mind, and they change the way that we perceive the world around us. So we're going to go into the light and a little bit of the shadow of this code. And let's get started.
All right, so let's start by defining distortion. And even before we jump into this definition, I think it's really important to note how nuanced this topic really is. And we're trying to keep these little segments short, concise, but even in doing this, we're noticing that there's so many layers that could be taken that we're really trying to just stick with the bigger terms of what distortion can look like and mean, and not the little ways distortion shows up in our everyday lives. So keep that in mind as we move through the slides and this code. So distortion means something looks, sounds, or feels different from how it really is objectively. So you might be having an experience, and what you're seeing, what you're feeling, what belief is coming into your mind is very different from the reality. So your interpretation of that experience shifts what's actually happening in the experience. So think of distortions. If we're even just thinking distortion wise, think of like walking into a little fun house, like at the fair or at the circus, and you're walking by a mirror. And that mirror distorts your figure. Either it makes you a lot larger or a lot thinner. And that would be a distortion of what is really there. Or another one, when you're listening, I don't know, this happens for me when I'm in the car and the music is really, really, really loud. Some people love that. For me, it distorts the music so much and it just like starts getting very piercy and my body feels uncomfortable. So there's a whole distortion of how I'm experiencing the music in those moments. So we can have distortions with our senses, through the senses that we experience, but also through the beliefs we have and through the interpretations that and the meaning we assign to particular things that happen in our lives. So these typically tend to happen for multiple reasons, mostly because our bodies like to protect us. So these distortions come through as a form of protection, especially if we've had a previous or a past experience that was not so great. And then another experience is looking or feeling or seeming to be similar. And we're kind of jumping the steps and that distortion comes in to be like, well, if this happened last time, then it must be happening again now, even if in that moment it's not actually happening again now. It's kind of just the past being imposed onto the present. So there's a big layer of wanting to feel safe in why these distortions appear. There is a sense of belonging. If we distort the way we feel, think, or are within ourselves, we might feel more like we belong, that we're accepted within the group. There's also this distortions in the ways the brain just does it to fill in gaps really quickly. Our minds like to be efficient, and they're wanting, it's like putting a puzzle piece together. It's like skipping from one step to the next. I'm like, oh, well, this is here, this is here. Let's just put these two pieces together, even if they don't really fit. And we're gonna say they fit because that just makes sense. So it does a lot of that to fill in the gaps as well. So some examples of distortion could be that if you're messaging someone and they don't reply you jump to, well, they must not care about me, or they must not have any time for me in the world. So it's a little bit of a jump. Maybe there's some truth to it, but sometimes it could be a little bit of a putting two puzzle pieces together that don't fit. If I'm not perfect, I won't be loved. I have to be agreeable to belong. So thinking of that sense of belonging and like that perception around how you need to fit in, and something is wrong with me. And we have a lot of these distortions from so many conditionings as well, not just things that have happened from us in the past, but things that have actually been said to us in our day-to-day lives. And a lot of times these distortions can feel really real. We might not even realize that we're distorted, but they really are interpretations. And as over time, as we do believe in these distortions, or these distortions kind of become our reality, the perception of our reality. Also, that's a whole piece that was supposed to mention at the beginning that I'll mention now. Distortion has everything to do with our personal perception and just perception. How are we perceiving the world? Which I kind of said I just didn't give that word particularly. And as we hold on or we attach ourselves to these particular perceptions of the world, of ourselves, of what we're experiencing, we can then become cling to particular identities, particular stories, particularly protective mechanisms, or even particular patterns that don't really serve us, but we've become so habituated in operating in those ways. So yeah, all of this really does take us away from what's happening truly in the present moment and might keep us stuck in particular loops or just stuck in the distortion of that protection or the distortion of what is not really there.
Mm. This is such a common part of the human experience. And it's so interesting to be able to develop more awareness around the mind and around our stories and the narratives that we tell ourselves, about the world around us, about how we're relating to everything that's happening in our lives. And that kind of brings us into the shadow element of this code, which is the illusion of distortion, is recognizing that all of these, let's say, mental projections of these stories and our perception, these are all ultimately illusions because we are actually forming the story and the narrative and the meaning around what it is that we are experiencing objectively. And so the shadow of this code really starts to play out when we begin to control the perception of what is objectively happening. And we're controlling it in a way that we can actually manage how we are seeing ourselves and how we are being perceived by others. And so a lot of this code lives within the mask. So it lives within performance and also just not honoring the truth of what is in this moment because these distortions are affecting how we are experiencing the present moment itself. So a lot of the ways that this shows up is showing up in a way that is agreeable, showing up in a way that is going to control people's perception of us. Oftentimes that is not being in truth. That is saying yes to things that you normally would want to say no to. It is pleasing. It is oftentimes becoming super hyper aware of other people to be able to control how they are perceiving you without even actually being in your own lived experience because we're so fixated on the distortion itself. And so when we are focusing so much on this perception of how we want to be perceived by others, of how we are perceiving others around us, then we're not really honoring ourselves and being present in our own lived experience. And oftentimes, when we find ourselves in attaching and fixating to these distortions, then it really brings us out of the present moment. It brings us out of our body, it brings us into our mind. And a lot of rumination and overthinking, which, if we're just talking about it objectively, these are all protective mechanisms of the mind, but they really do take energy to engage with it, to believe it, to operate from that place. So when we're able to recognize that these things are all illusions and that they're not the objective reality of what is in this moment, then we're able to create a bit more non attachment between the stories, between perceptions, and just around like caring about others. Like I think that this is a huge part of being human and being social creatures, is that we want to belong and we want to be liked. And so oftentimes, because of that core desire that we have, that's where we can attach or try to control this perception. So the ways that it shows up, like we've already said a few, is pleasing as protection. So this is avoiding conflict, disapproval, abandoning your own truth and your own needs. Self-erasure, so suppressing your own true feelings, any limits, desires that you may have are not being expressed. Approval seeking, so this is where we are focusing on the external, focusing on others to be able to find approval from them and feel belonging. Emotional over responsibilities. This is like an over functioning where we're overextending ourselves, overdoing it in order to maintain harmony. And finally, goodness is performance. So this is where we are showing up and we're saying yes and we want to say no, not honoring those boundaries. And then that just really starts to create this resentment and exhaustion and this disconnection from ourselves. So a big part of this distortion and the shadow is how can we remain in self respect and self honoring, even when it disappoints the image that others had of you? So, how can we continue to choose ourselves, to choose our truth, and to be in our authentic expression, even if that may change the ways that others are perceiving us? And really recognizing that ultimately, you can be the hero in one person's story and the villain in another and still be you. And so these are all stories. These are all stories that are projected onto us, that we project onto ourselves. And just coming back to that remembrance of the fact that these are just that. They are just mental projections. They are just stories. They are ultimately illusions. And they don't ever form the full truth around ourselves and what we're experiencing. So definitely important to keep that in mind, because knowing that, it really does support non-attachment to them itself.
So thank you, Milena, for bringing us into the shadow of distortion. So now let's talk a little bit about the medicine, which you already kind of started sprinkling in a little bit there at the end. So the medicine really is the courage to see clearly and the willingness to meet yourself without the mask, which can be really scary. And it does take a lot of courage to do and willingness. It is really the willingness to do that. So this code particularly asks us to pause before believing every thought that we have, because not every thought is meant to be believed. A lot of the thoughts that are passing through our mind are either not really ours. They're kind of just like, think of it as like a really busy traffic or like a highway that's just like nonstop going. You don't need to worry about everything that's going on there, but it's all going to keep going anyways. Question the stories you tell yourself, especially if it's a story that you tell yourself often, that you attach to a lot of different things. Question it and be like, wait, why is this here? And not, and compassionately, and not like in a judgmental, like, why are you here? More of like, why do I tell myself this story often or all the time? Or why is this just something that comes up? And be curious about it. This really does help separate facts from interpretations or from past experiences or from beliefs or conditioned ideas from society, from people, and it helps us sort really what is ours, what do we resonate with, what do we not resonate with, what are we distorting into our image, and it helps us sort to notice when you're reacting from past conditions and not present moment, which I already said, but let's just say it again because that one's important.
Bring it home.
So yeah, all these things to like reflect on self and just where there may be distortions in your life is really to just gently remove these masks that we might be wearing, these distortions that might have infiltrated. Yes.
May I just say that there will always be distortions?
Always.
Is that as aware of as we can become of them, there will always be some type of distortion just because of the ways that our mind are designed to survive and to keep us safe from what it perceives as threat. So as we start to begin to connect with ourselves more and do a little bit more of this work to ground into our lived experience and our body and being able to perceive what really is happening, then we're able to, that itself, changing, being able to support our state of being is going to eventually start shifting a lot of this perception and a lot of these distortions, but they will still always be there. Just
And I
FYI.
think I didn't want to say this at the beginning, but now that you've said this, I'm just going to bring it in now. Our day-to-day lives are distortions because of how we perceive our lives anyways. Like, yes, there's big distortions, but there's also the perception of how Milena's living the life, the perception of how I'm living life. And the best example is people that see it, the glass is half full, the glass is half empty. That itself is a distortion. You're either seeing life in one way, seeing life in another way. And it really is dependent on the perception. So what perception are you wanting to cultivate for the life you're wanting to live is essentially the question you're asking yourself to at the end of the day. Um, and yes, where am I assuming instead of seeing? Where am I shaping reality to feel safe, accepted, or in control? A lot of those, like those questions or those those shadowy parts Milena named in the last slide, going through each of those and noticing where do these come up in my life? How do these come up in my life? Do they come up in my life? Maybe they don't. Maybe it's not something for you to fit on. And where am I performing instead of being? That's a big one. That's where I'm able to find a lot of my distortions because then that's really not grounded in anything real for who I truly am or who I authentically am. It's really who I've seen or perceived is accepted and how I need to be to belong in particular spaces. So these are all just kind of little nuggets of questions, of thoughts to reflect on how your life may be distorted in ways that you're not consenting to. Because a distortion, you could consent to a distortion, but there is ways that you cannot be consenting to a distortion, and the distortion is taking over you. So once you can ground or notice or ask yourself these questions and notice where there's little distortions, you go from reacting to a scenario to having more awareness about it, from assuming things to being curious, and from distortion to a lot more clarity. And I'd even say to more consent in your life. And you don't need to fix yourself to see clearly. You only need to be willing to look.
That is so powerful. Is it's really just a willingness to be curious, to hold loving space by yourself, non-judgmental space, because obviously who's going to want to bare their soul and their truth and remove their mask when they feel judged? So it's one of those things where throughout this process and throughout all of these codes, we're really just learning how to come into right relationship with ourselves, which eventually then ripples out into others. And then eventually that ripples out into our world and everyone that we are interacting with. And so really just recognizing that the more that we can bring kindness and compassion and non-judgment to ourselves, the more that we are able to actually receive ourselves, to be more in our own actual authentic truth, and to really just come home to ourselves, like to be able to meet ourselves from a much more open and curious place. So this is going to bring us into our last slide of this code, which is just giving you a few words to feel into in terms of the shadow of this code. This is the illusion of distortion. This is where we are abandoning our objective and true embodied lived experience. And we kind of go from the body into the mind, and we're operating from the mental space. And when we do that, this is oftentimes where we're fixating with the story and how we're being perceived and trying to control others. And so this is kind of where that self-abandonment comes in. And these are just some words for you to feel into how this shadow may show up for you. Again, depending on where we are in our life journey, there might be certain words that are going to resonate more with you right now based on what lessons are being learned in this lived experience that you're in right now versus in another point in your life. So really just honoring what you resonate with here. A lot of things we've already expressed. So emotional labor, avoiding conflict, this compliance or appeasing, self-erasure is not honoring ourselves, this people pleaser. And then we have the lesson, which is really this liberation. It's removing the mask. It's getting out of this space of performance and really just being yourself. And a lot of that is the self-respect. It's embodied boundaries. It's having integrity with yourself. And when you notice that maybe you're jumping into this space of performance, okay, how can we shift gears and come back to our lived experience and who we truly are? And so also compassionate shedding, relational honesty, whole womanhood. So really honoring all of ourselves, even when we don't feel like we are our ultimate best self, high energy self, positive self, we're still showing up as we are because we honor those parts of us too. And we don't have to wear this mask. We don't have to perform to be liked, to belong, to feel worthy or valuable to exist. So this is really just a lot of these lessons and these distortions. They all cross pollinate from one code to the next. So you will see a lot of these keywords that are coming up between codes. But yeah, really just giving you something to feel into right now. And just to close off, what to
And
look
even
forward
just I want to
to.
speak quickly on that cross pollination. I don't know if people are picking up on
Mhm.
that thread of self love and compassion towards self is like literally almost in part of all the medicine for every single one of these codes.
Everyone.
So stay tuned for transmission 5, the code of protection that we're going to be covering in the next 2 weeks. We have 2 codes left for this volume before we are going to start switching gears to season 2, which I do want to give a little bit of a foreshadow because Milena and I are so
So
excited for
excited.
season 2. We have some juicy content coming for y'all, but we still got 2 codes left. So come back in 2 weeks to hear the code of protection.
Not you saying how juicy it is, but then not giving them anything to like masticate on. Okay.
Yeah,
I'll give a little drop, a little teaser drop. So we're talking, I feel like we've focused so much on the individual and the self, and really just like coming into this creative energy within ourselves, creating ourselves, recreating ourselves. But season 2 is going to be focused a lot more on the other, on the world, on our society. And it's going to be speaking to a lot of topics that are collectively affecting us, impacting us, and coming into our awareness. So we're going to be talking about some more societal, collective, relational pieces in our next season. So I'm sure it'll definitely be an activation, and our intention is for it to cause conversation, to prompt questioning, coming back to the questioning, and discernment, to feel into what feels true for you. Because in a world that is filled with information, discernment is one of those incredibly important and valuable skills that we will also be speaking to a lot during season 2. Is that enough?
And it's also such a return to like your own authority and your own voice, your own power, your own truth, as she said, and consent. Big, 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 big on giving consent back to people. And on a final note,
Finalist,
we have also recently launched our first retreat. For those who are in Montreal or the surrounding areas, we are hosting our first Venusian Womb, and we're collaborating with the Soul's Haven from June 12th to 14th in Quebec, Entre-Lacs, at the Soul's Haven. And it is all about You Are the Muse. So if you've been listening or you listen and you're in that area and you would like to journey with us in person, go check out our website. We've got tons of juicy information there on that.
We have a beautiful landing page, and it has all of the words and photos and energy for you to feel into. You are the art and you are the artist. And so we are really coming back to that remembrance in a playful, pleasurable, presence-filled way. And we're just really excited to connect with you all in person and to actually be able to journey together in the ways that we most naturally do. So yeah, super excited to share that with you. And on that note, we will see you when we see you next.
Thank you for being here and tending these codes with us. If today's transmission stirred something, allow yourself a moment to ground through breath, stillness, or movement. You can return to these episodes whenever you need reorientation or support. Until next time, keep listening to your body and let the womb guide you.